Welcome back to AutoTechNick. Now I just finished this timing belt service on this 1997 Ferrari 456, and now that that's done, all we have left to do is, well, everything. So today we're going to be fully reassembling this car, getting it back up and running, doing all of our final service checks, and getting the car back out on the road. So in our last video, I walked you guys through the procedure to replace the timing belts, get the new ones installed, tension them, and also we ran through the camshaft timing, which, however, in this particular car, we got massively lucky, very fortunate, where we were able to get the car torn all the way down. And mind you, I removed the front cover and all the front timing drive gears, reassembled all that, and went back to the timing belts, and we were able to still maintain our camshaft timing. Once we went through our timing belt checks after the new belts were installed and tensioned, we didn't have to make any changes to get them within Ferrari specs. Pretty rare for it to work out that well for me. Fortunately, it did. And with all that done, we're ready to move forward on the reassembly of the engine. Usually where I like to start off, honestly, is to get the engine sealed back up. So that means putting the valve covers back on. That's really twofold. I like putting the valve covers on. Obviously, I don't want to leave this exposed any longer than I need to. But also, the process of getting the valve covers back on and getting them sealed up, and so that way we don't have any gaskets push out or we don't pinch an O-ring. It ends up taking a little bit more time than you would think working with the gaskets that we have. So I kind of like to get that hard stuff out of the way because for me it seems like everything after that's pretty straightforward, a bit more smooth sailing. I can get some momentum going. We do have a fair bit to talk about on these valve covers, so I think that's where we're going to start on today's video. And I'm going to show you guys all my tips and tricks to getting these valve covers on so they're sealed up nice and tight for the long run. So let's start here with our valve covers. What I want to talk about is really our valve cover gasket and the tendency for them to slide out right here on the corners like so. They essentially pivot here where this last bolt is, and they push out on the ends of the valve cover on all four sides. In the video when we covered the disassembly of the valve covers, I mentioned that if you stake or punch the ends of the rails right here, that raises some metal. There's really no good way to show you guys because it's so minor. If we get up in there, you can kind of see that there's some high spots there. So that raised metal right there helps bite into this gasket and pinch it so it doesn't want to slide out. That's really critical right here at this junction because this paper gasket ends right there, and there's that transition where this paper gasket seals up to that rubber O-ring. So if that slides out, that paper separates from the O-ring and you're going to have an oil leak, which is incredibly common. Now on the disassembly, I talked about it, and when I pulled off the valve cover on bank 1, I found that they were already punched. However, I didn't cover it in that video, but once I started cleaning everything up and getting the gaskets off, I found that the cylinder head did not have any marks whatsoever, and it wasn't punched. So you can see that I've gone back through and I've punched those as well. And also on the disassembly, I mentioned that my gasket was pushing out over here on bank 2. And lo and behold, once I got that valve cover off, the valve cover and the cylinder head were not punched at all. So on this engine, it only had those punches done to the valve cover of bank 1, not the cylinder head of bank 1, and nothing on bank 2. I don't know what the train of thought was there on the last time that someone or whoever did that process, but it is something I do on both surfaces. So that way it kind of pinches in and clamps into that gasket. And it really makes a big difference on the ability for that gasket to stay in place and not slide out. I did all that, and you can see that I've already gone through and cleaned up all of the valve cover rails. I did my punches there, and also much easier to show you here on the valve cover on the bench, but where these O-rings sit right in here, from the factory, they just cut in this groove for the O-ring and then they machine the valve cover, and it leaves basically a 90-degree edge right there. And when you slide that plug with the O-ring in and then clamp that into the head with the matching 90-degree edge, it ends up tearing and pinching this O-ring, which again is another source of a leak. So to combat that, you take a small file and you can see where we've beveled that edge and rounded it out so that way it doesn't bite into this O-ring. Again, when I pulled this apart, these were beveled. However, they weren't beveled enough, and it was still biting into the O-ring a little bit. So the last person had the right intentions. They went through and did file them down, but they didn't go far enough. And I will say that the pinching on the O-ring wasn't as bad as it usually is, but it was still there. So once everything's cleaned up, I went back through. I still filed this down, rounded them out, and you have to do all of them all the way across on both valve covers. That's one thing that takes a fair amount of time in addition to getting all your gaskets cleaned up, everything scraped off. These gaskets are sealed on with sealant all the way across. They do tear, come off in pieces. So I take them off. Honestly, I just use a flat razor blade to work my gaskets off. This is the quickest, cleanest method I've used. Then I'll come back with a maroon Scotch-Brite with some WD-40. It helps lubricate it. That WD-40 helps lift any silicone that's left on the rail. It gives it a nice finish. It doesn't remove a lot of material. It is a manual process, but it's honestly not as bad as you would think. Exact same process I do up here on the engine. You can see that put some rags in there so that way I don't have any of that sealant fall off. A lot of it falls in these channels here, so we have to vacuum that up. I leave my spark plugs in, although they're loose, so I can rotate the engine over during the service. But I leave them in so that way if anything falls down in here, it doesn't actually fall down into the cylinders. Certainly taking my precautions to keep everything clean and keep the silicone and gasket out of the engine. So with everything cleaned, prepped, and ready to go, we're actually ready to start putting these valve covers back onto the engine. For the valve cover gaskets, you can see this is how the gaskets come from Ferrari, where it's a one-piece gasket. We know that these plugs here sit in the back of the valve cover, so you can quickly see that it's not going to work because this gasket right here is existing in the space where this plug needs to be. And you can see I have this gasket down here that I've already broken into 3 sections. That is the first step I need to do in order to get these gaskets fit onto the engine. Yes, we have to fit our valve cover gaskets to the engine. All right, before we move forward, let's take a second and talk about the sealants that we're going to use to seal up this valve cover. Now, from the factory, Ferrari does use a sealant on both sides of this paper gasket, and what they use is this 3-bond 1211, which is a very white and very pliable sealant, and it works pretty good, but I would say that it's not a very durable or robust sealant. It's literally just putting a small bead on your gasket, and then I run my finger across it to wipe it off, just to leave a small smear of the sealant on there, and also to be sure that I don't have any chunks or dried sections in it to get it evenly distributed across the gasket. We have our gaskets trimmed and fit. I have them upside down on the valve cover because I'll use the valve cover as like a holder to apply and smear my sealant on the bottom side. Then I will go and transfer my valve covers to the engine, and then I'll apply the sealant to the valve cover before I assemble everything. However, I said sealants, and there's 2 types of sealant. I will say that this is what Ferrari uses from the factory. They use it on all of these green paper gaskets on the engine. And I will say from my experience, that is also, I would say, industry standard for most Ferrari technicians that are working on these cars. Even when I get a car in that's from out of state, that's been worked on by another shop, finding that 1211 as the sealant on the gaskets is pretty much the standard. Every now and then you'll find something different, but I would say that most of us all use this. For me, the reason why is honestly the cleanup when you're doing the timing belt service. You have to think that these valve covers are coming off every 3-5 years, depending on what the customer chooses to service this car at interval wise. We have to come through and clean all these gaskets off, clean all the silicone off, and reapply it. This 1211 works pretty well, but the main benefit that I actually like about this 1211 is its cleanup. It is actually pretty forgiving to get cleaned up and off of the engine, so it saves a fair amount of work during the timing belt service, as opposed to this other sealant that I like to use, which is 3-bond 1217H. This is a much stronger, a bit more durable, and I would probably say more adhesive. It's like more sticky. That sealant, I would say, yes, it is a superior sealant. It's more aggressive, it's more durable, it has a stronger bond. However, if I were to apply this sealant to both sides of that gasket all the way down the length of this valve cover, it makes it very difficult to get the valve cover off of the engine, but it also makes cleanup very difficult as well. There is times where I get cars that are sealed up like that, and in my opinion, it's a bit unnecessary and it creates a lot of work when you have to go do the timing belt service. It's not fun. It's a little bit of paying it forward to the next guy that's going to be working on the car. I'm going to be sealing these valve covers in a way that they're going to seal up and not leak oil, not have the gaskets push out, and make it to the next service interval without any issues with the gaskets at all. However, I also want to seal it up so that way the next guy that's working on it doesn't have to spend all day cleaning up the mess that I made for him. The way we're going to achieve that is we're going to use this 1211, I would say, on the majority of all the sealing surfaces. So we're going to seal up the O-ring on this cam plate, which I will put that 1211 halfway around this cam plate, and then we're going to put it into the engine and clean off any of the squeeze out. Then I'll come and put that 1211 and cover all of the green paper gasket only up here and then only on the spark plug sections. I leave these, obviously no sealant goes on them because it touches nothing. So we'll put our small layer on here and also on the upper piece. Now before we go and set these on the engine, is what I'm going to do is take our better sealant, this 1217, and I will take that sealant and very sparingly put small little dabs at the corner where every O-ring meets the head. So up here, so there's going to be 4 little dabs up on the front O-rings, and then I'm going to come back at the rear O-ring and do dabs up there as well. Again, we don't need to worry about anything back here because we have another gasket and a cam seal plate that will seal up separately. So I'll put those little dabs in those locations, and let's pretend this is the head. I'll have that dab right there. And the reason why I do that before I put these gaskets in is because then when I take these to the head and slide them on, I can slide that in, and I want to try to get some of this 1217 on both sides of this gasket into that corner. So we're just going to squeeze that in there, and then we're going to come back and put our 1211 on our rails up here just like we did our gaskets. We're going to finish sealing up the top of the O-ring up here. On that, it's usually easier just to get it into the grooves here of the valve cover, and the same thing at the front rather than trying to get that onto those O-rings on the head. So we'll just get the grooves on the valve cover rather than dealing with this up here. And then once that's done, we'll set the valve cover on and get everything installed. Now, one word of caution. When you're applying this in the corners, I said sparingly, you're not going to use too much. If you put too much here in the corner, and I'll show you. So if we put a big dab of that 1217 up here in the corner, not so much this piece, but down here on the bottom, when we go to tighten the valve cover down, that valve cover is going to push and start pushing the excess of sealant out, which is fine, that's normal. But if we put too much back here, that sealant is going to get in between this cam plate and the back of this gasket. So it'll get, right up here, it's going to get right into this junction. And if you put too much in there, as you tighten everything down, it acts like a hydraulic fluid, and it'll actually push your gasket out as you tighten and torque your valve cover down. So you want to be sparingly when you install it, but also when we're torquing our valve cover down, I'll actually take a pocket screwdriver and I'll hold this edge of the gasket in position as I tighten this bolt to be sure that I can maintain the position of this gasket and let that excess of sealant push out and not disrupt where the gasket's sitting. So I'm going to set you guys down so we can see this process in action, getting this valve cover reinstalled on the engine. All right, we're going to get started with getting our 1211 on this rear cam plug so we can get that set in the head. And we're going to just do our best to get it around halfway around the plug. That'll work. Get this set in place. And we'll get any push out excess out of there. And we're doing that so that way that 1217, that gray stuff, will take place of that. We don't want that 1211 where we want the more robust sealant. So we'll just clean that out. There. That's good. So now at the plug in, we're just going to put our small dabs of the 1217 at the corners of all of our O-rings. And just a very small amount. Ooh. Looks like we got a little overkill back over here. We'll take some of that off. Then back to the bench, we're going to take our 1211 and get a coat on all of our gaskets here. And this is the side of the gasket that's going to be facing the head. So you can see as I'm just running my bead on, it's not a whole lot. And I'd rather be a little too light than too heavy. That's really where just using my finger to spread it around will help me determine if it's too heavy or too light. Obviously, if we need to add some, we'll add it. If we need to remove it, we'll remove it. You'll probably be able to see that this is a very light coat. You can almost see through it in most sections. No need to put any more than this on. It all that's going to do is just have a lot of squeeze out and make a much bigger mess. We'll just get that spread around. All right, and with those spread, we'll get these positioned on the engine. And I come back with the screwdriver and just get these gaskets seated in position where I want, and try to get that 1211 pushed through, or I should say the 1217 in these corners. Now I will say, like in areas at the top, I had more squeeze out than I wanted, so I'm going to clean that off. And it was actually more of the 1211. Get that cleaned off, and I don't have much right here of the 1217, so I'm going to come back and just make little dabs on the top side to make sure I have enough of that 1217. The rear looks good, but we're going to add just a little bit more here so that way I can be sure it seals tight. All right, I'm good with that. Let's get the valve cover prepped. And then we're going to do the grooves for the O-rings. And this is the rear, which only has one, and it's on the intake camshaft. And we'll do the front, both grooves. There we go. So we got all of our 1217 in our corners of the O-ring. Everything's sealed up. Our valve cover's prepped. We've already done all of our pre-prep. Gaskets in position. We've retorqued our cam caps, cleaned everything up. Everything's set. We're ready to put this back on. So I'm trying to be sure I get all the sealant off my hands so I don't put a bunch of it on the valve cover. It's just too easy to do if you're not paying that much attention. Try to make sure our spark plug gaskets stay in position. And now we'll grab the hardware and start slowly working that down. All right, so I just have the hardware in hand tight. Now I'm going to start bringing it down tight. That's where I'm going to bring my pocket screwdriver, and I'm going to focus first on the edges of the valve cover to be sure that they don't push out as we drive the valve cover down because of that extra sealant we have in the corners. So I'll just start down here, and you'll see the sealant start to push out as I'm tightening it down. And I have my screwdriver resting on the surface of the cylinder head and up against the valve cover so that gasket cannot slide out. And I'm just gradually tightening it down. You can see not too much push out. And we'll do the same over here on the top side. That gasket was out a little bit, and I just pushed it in so it's tight. And again, the same thing back here at the rear. We can see that the gasket is protruding some. So if we're careful, we can get our screwdriver on there and just push it all the way in so it's up against that O-ring. Tighten this bolt down as we're holding it. And that's where those punch marks that we made on the valve cover and head really pay us favors, is it really grips that gasket and holds it tight so it doesn't slide out even after I take the screwdriver off. And we'll see if we can get down here for the bottom side. It's a lot tighter. Need a different tool combination. And that's snug. We'll get the center. And now, fix our fender cover. We'll come back through and get the rest of the bolts snug. And we need to pay attention to the gasket, like up here at the top. We can push that in some. But also our valve cover gasket in the center, we want to make sure that that's in position. So just using my hand to hold both in place. Again, we're not torquing anything down. We're just getting it snug so nothing can move around on us. Clean up any finger marks that I have on here. Any extra sealant. Now for the sealant that pushes out on the gasket on the sides and the spark plug tubes, I actually don't go to wipe that up just yet because it's really just going to smear and it gets in this wrinkle finish and it's hard to clean up. I actually wait for that to start to get tacky and start to kind of set up a little bit. Then I'll come back through and you can actually just run your pocket screwdriver or a small razor blade right across it and it kind of just peels off. It's honestly just a lot quicker and easier to get that stuff cleaned up once it's dry as opposed to when it's wet. And I mean, that's preference. There's two trains of thought on that, I think, where some people like to leave that squeeze out there. They feel that that's kind of like a proof that they were there and they sealed it. As for myself, I think it's ugly. So I clean it all up so I just think it looks better. Obviously, it doesn't have any outcome or effect on long-term sealing. It's just personal preference. Everything's just snugged down. The valve cover is where we want it to be. I'm going to grab our torque wrench. We're going to go to torque it. We're going to start again at the edges just to be sure. We're going to keep an eye, make sure it doesn't push out as we give it a little bit more tightening force and get this thing torqued down. So just making sure our gasket doesn't push out. Naturally, you're getting some more sealant pushing out. Now that our valve cover is installed and torqued, I just wanted to drop you guys in and show you what we have for squeeze out. You can see that there's really not too much at all, especially in the areas where I added the extra sealant, and all the way down along the rail, just a hint of squeeze out right there. Same thing in the spark plug tubes, really not too bad. And like I said, you want to have good coverage, you want to have that sealed on there, but you don't want to put excess sealant, because yes, you're going to have more squeeze out on the outside to take care of and manage, but also you got to think that it's potentially squeezing on the inside of the engine as well, where we don't want any sealant. Just a very small light coat, it'll do you well. Now that we have the valve cover on bank 1 installed and torqued down, I'm going to focus my attention over here on the bank 2 valve cover. Since the process is exactly the same, I'm not going to bore you with it. I'm just going to set you guys down. I'm going to focus on getting it on, sealed up, installed, and torqued, really getting this side of the engine to the same state that we have over here on bank 1. Once I'm to that point, I'll bring you guys back and we'll continue on getting this thing reassembled. Alright, so our bank 2 valve cover went on without any fanfare, pretty much a wash, rinse, repeat of bank 1. The only thing to note on this particular application is I have a couple bolts, particularly right here and back over here, which have standoffs for the throttle cable bracket. So I was able to use the existing bolt that is supposed to be there without the bracket, but I put some nuts on it to shim it because it was too long. And I'm unable to get the other bolt out of the throttle cable bracket when the throttle cable is still in the bracket. So I just grab a generic bolt and put that in. And I do have those torqued to spec. And I do that so that way the valve cover is all torqued to spec evenly as all my sealant cures and dries. We're going to have to come back and take those bolts out and put in the proper hardware further on reassembly, which we'll wait until the sealant's dry to do so. We'll have to do the same thing up here for these bolts because they have little metal covers that hold the wire harness in place, and we're just not quite there to those steps yet. So I install all the hardware now, torque everything to spec. I'll come back and fix those later. Our sealant up here is still wet, so I'm going to continue to let that cure up and dry before we come back and clean it up. We also are going to have to come back and address our housing for our cam sensor over there where the camshaft is. But as you can see right here, we have a good shot that our valve cover gasket actually protrudes from the back of the valve cover and cylinder head. And that is normal. So it's kind of like along the same lines of how I'm letting that sealant cure up so it's easier to clean off. I'm going to let all that dry so that I can come back. I'm going to take a razor blade. I need to shave that gasket flush with the head and the valve cover to get rid of it. So that way we can put the new gasket on for the cam sensor housing and finish that repair. Meaning I need to let that stuff cure up before I can come back and address it because I don't want to make a bigger mess with the small amount of squeeze out that we have. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus my attention to the front of the engine and start reassembling our timing belt covers. I can get my ancillary drive belts on and the ancillary drive belt covers installed onto the car. Fortunately for me, I've already done myself a favor early on and I've cleaned everything up and I have all the covers very clean on the inside and outside. We have our new belts here. All of our hardware is ready to go, ready to get everything installed. And we have our frequency gauge that we're going to use to tension our belts. Before I just jump into that, there's one more thing I need to do, and really is what I'm aiming for here is the most ideal or optimized workflow for myself, and that is our fuel injectors. As part of the timing belt service or a major service that I do on these cars, I'll go through, remove the fuel injectors, and I'll run them on my machine, run a flow test on them, check the volume that they flow, the spray pattern, leakage test, and then run them through the ultrasonic cleaner. and repeat the test after the fact to see if there's any change or improvement. Because of that, you can see I have everything set up for the bank 1 injectors in my tool. I've already gone through, and we can look at my little sheet here that I use to document everything. I've already gone through and measured my resistance, measured my leakage test, so I need to move into a spray test, my spray pattern, and then actually get into the flow tests. Now, the reason why I'm addressing the fuel injectors now at this point of the service is because I just want to be smart with my time. I do need to man the machine while I'm running all my flow checks so I can document what each injector is outputting and get it populated into my sheet. However, when the injectors are in the ultrasonic cleaner, I don't want to just be standing here waiting for them. I also don't want to have the car fully assembled and be waiting on my fuel injectors before I can put them back in the car and get it running. So the way I look at it is I'm going to just pause on the car for a second right now. I'm going to get the injectors and run the initial spray test on bank 1. Then I can get them in the ultrasonic cleaner. Then while they're in the cleaner, I can work to get my timing belts and covers back on. Once they're finished up, I'll just jump back, run another test, see the after results, get it documented, and then I'll be able to repeat this process for the bank 2 injectors, all the while I'm still working on the car. With our ultimate end goal objective is having all of the injectors ready to go by the time the car is ready to go. Alright, so I got you guys set down so I can use both of my hands. And the first thing I'm going to do is just run through the spray test, which is going to give me an idea of our spray pattern across all of the injectors. Really, I'm just looking for uniformity across these injectors to make sure they're all the same. A good even spray pattern all the way around the perimeter of the injector. And they all look pretty good. And we're just checking our flow here. So 47, 47, 48, 50, 49. So pretty consistent. So we're going to run through and drain those. All right, now we're going to run the injector flow test. $41, about 42, 45, 44, cylinder 5, 44, and cylinder 6, 41. So a fair amount of discrepancy there. And now we're going to just move into the auto test where we're going to check our pulse flow at varying RPMs, but we'll drain it first. Okay, so with all of our preliminary tests out of the way, it's time to move to the bulk of what this injector test is going to be doing. So we're going to run our automated injector test. It's going to run all 6 injectors, and we're going to be measuring the flow at 3 specific set points. It's going to be 650 RPM, 4,500 RPM, 6,000 RPM. At each set point, it's going to stop. I'm going to observe how much fluid flowed through each injector at each set point, get that documented in my sheet. So let's get this test underway. Okay, so we got all of our pre-cleaning data on bank 1 input. I got the ultrasonic cleaner running. I'm going to run them on a 30-minute cycle before we put them back in and retest them. So I'm going to continue cleaning, reflow testing the injectors for bank 1, then I'll take care of bank 2. But for you guys, we're going to continue to focus our attention on the car, getting the front timing covers reinstalled, along with our ancillary belts. Well, the engine's going back together quite nicely, and honestly, it's starting to look like the engine that it should. The nice, beautiful Ferrari V12. We got our timing belt covers on. I got the rear dust shields on. All the hardware's tight. I installed our ancillary belts, and I tensioned them, and I used our frequency gauge to set the tension. On our AC and alternator belt, that was set to 160 hertz. On our power steering pump belt here, that was set to 120 hertz, and I measured each belt in one location on the longest run only. So the front of the engine's pretty much wrapped up, and once I got that done, I came back to our valve covers, and as you can see, I cleaned off the excessive sealant that was coming out, got that all scraped up, removed, vacuumed up, and got everything cleaned up here in preparation to taking care of the top of the engine. What we're going to focus our attention to next is I have the rear camshaft sensor housing I need to install back there on the exhaust cam. So it's this guy right here that needs to get bolted on, and it fits on over 2 studs in the head. Then it has this 1 Allen bolt in the upper hole right here that goes into the valve cover. This is the last section we have to deal with sealing, because we have this gasket, and it's really going to be the same philosophy on sealing this gasket up as what we did with the valve covers. I'm going to use the 1211 all the way around the perimeter, and this gasket's going to go on. Do notate that there's 2 dowels on the head, so there's larger holes here in the gasket you have to fit. We're going to do 1211 all the way around this cover, gasket on. Again, 1211 all the way around this cover. The only exception is where our junctions are at for the valve cover to the cylinder head. We're going to use the 1217 and those key areas to seal it up nicely. Now, another thing to note back here, which I've already done, is the gasket, or the paper gasket, usually sticks out and protrudes. So you got to come back through here with a razor blade and cut those off flush, so that way the new gasket's going to sit flush up on there. And really, now that you can see that, that is the junction where we're going to want that 1217, that better sealant, right where that gasket sticks out. Everything else is the 1211. Now you can see that I don't have much room back here to get this on, so I'm going to focus on getting this on. I don't think there's any realistic way I can get a camera in there while I get that reinstalled. Now, in addition to getting that rear cam sensor housing on, I need to get the spark plug wires put back in. We are installing brand new spark plugs, which I do with every belt service. Now, I keep the spark plugs resting loose in the engine while I'm doing the belt service, because that way it helps prevent anything from falling in, and I leave them out so that way I don't have to fight the compression as I crank the engine over. So I'm going to finish installing the spark plugs to get them all tightened down. We can put our spark plug wires and cover in place, so that way they're not sitting over here. And also need to work to get our wire harnesses set in position and routed in preparation to getting the intake manifold on. So I'm going to get those items taken care of, and then I'll bring you guys right back so we can work to get the intake manifold installed. Alright, so we got the rear cam sensor housing in, cam sensors installed, plugged in, got our spark plugs installed, and our spark plug wire plastic holders here. Now, a lot of times these are broken and you do need to be very careful with them. And I think actually what ends up happening over time in heat cycles is the plastic on these end up shrinking, and you'll find that these bolts, the holes for them don't line up to the valve cover. So to get these installed, I start back here with the rear bolt. This bolt will line up pretty well, but I leave it out. And this third bolt up here is a little off, but I can get that bolt in. Granted, I only have this one back in here, just a couple threads started. And I can use my extension and bit driver to kind of get it levered into the hole and then push it over and get it started. And once I get that started by a couple threads, I do the same thing up here on this hole. So you kind of have to get the bolt at an angle to get started and hold the valve cover, and then kind of pull everything forward, which puts a lot of tension on this plastic to get that bolt in. Once I get all four started, then I go and bolt them down. Now you can see that I have the wire harness here routed with our covers on. I have our new intake gaskets on, and I've already gone through and confirmed our intake ports are clean. There's nothing in there. And on these wire harnesses, so these feed to our TPS sensors, our idle control valve, and our airflow meter, and on this side also our intake air temperature. They need the cross. So if you look back here, you can see that this crosses and this feeds to the harness that's coming over here from the left side, because although this is on the right side of the car, it feeds the left-hand Motronic and everything on the left-hand side of the engine, because our air crosses on our plenums. So it's the same thing over here for the left-hand wiring, which feeds to the right-hand side of the engine. Now back here is our connectors for our fuel injectors, and these do not cross. So these will be able to be plugged in on either connector on the wire harness on the intake manifold, but you can see where this routes into the main harness, so I know that this one is for my right side, and I know that this one's for my left side. I just tuck these a little bit out of the way back here, because on this particular application I have enough room once the intake is on to get my hand back there and get these connected onto the connectors. On the later cars, especially like 550s, 575s, you have to get those connectors done when the intake manifold's halfway on. Those later cars, the intakes are bigger, they're a lot heavier, it's a lot easier with two people. This early car, I have enough space where I can just set the intake all the way on, then plug everything in, so I don't really have to worry about it. We plugged in our coolant temp sensor. I had that unplugged, so I had my tray would fit in here, and made sure my hose clamps are tight, and really everything down inside the valley of the engine is buttoned up. And we got the intake over here flipped over, and I was just making sure my sealing surface is clean and it's all prepped, and we are ready to get it installed. Here, as you can see, the connectors to the wire harness for the fuel injectors, and they are separate for each bank. So that's where if you get those crossed up with your connectors right here, you can easily cross them, and then you're going to be firing the wrong bank of injectors, and it gets both Motronics and everything in the car pretty confused. Now is also a good time. Check the integrity of all your vacuum hoses while you're here. All mine checked out pretty good. Everything's set. So now we're going to work to get the intake manifold put back in place. Set it down and get a better grip, and probably let that throttle cable just rest. Hopefully it doesn't get caught on anything. Bring it back, and we overshot our head. There we go. Just like that. Got it installed. Throttle cable's good. Vacuum line is good. And we got plenty of space in the back. All of our vacuum hoses. Excellent. Now, we need the work to get it bolted down. Alright, so we got the intake on without any fuss, and now we need to focus on getting our hardware installed and getting it all torqued down. Now you can see our mounting studs right here on the head, and this one right here on the front, I have tons of access. This one right here, you can see that because this runner is crossing, that I don't have a straight shot, that I actually have to come around this runner and in, but I still don't have a straight shot because the runner's in the way. So it's really only this forward one and that rear one where you have a straight, easy shot. And on the rest of them, you actually have to work your tooling around the runner so that way you can get it onto the nut down at the head. I prefer to use this 8-inch 1/4-inch drive extension, and it's a wobble extension, and that wobble that's on the end of it gives my socket just enough movement where I can get it worked in and around the plenum, and you can see that I can get it down to the bolt right there. That overcomes one of the problems, and I use this, let's say when we took the manifold off, this is what I used and it worked great. You can get it in there, get all the hardware loose, get it off, but the other problem is getting everything started, or on disassembly, getting your nuts out so you don't drop them. Come over to the bench, and for one, the hardware is just a flange lock nut, so it is specific hardware for the intake manifolds. They don't use a separate washer, which is unusual for Ferrari, but that makes it a lot easier because we don't have to deal with washers down in there. We only have to deal with these nuts. Now, years ago, I purchased this magnetic shallow 10mm socket, hoping that this would be the trick on the end of my extension. If you look at these nuts, since it's a lock nut, it actually has this rounded dome on the top of the nut. And also, if you look at this socket, it's incredibly shallow because of the magnet that's in there. So when you put this in there, it doesn't go very far over the nut. If you're doing something straight on, not so bad, but since we're kind of working around the plenums at a bit of an angle, a lot of the times the socket's not dead square on the nut, and I found that this magnetic one, because of that, really didn't work. Now, this magnetic socket is a snap-on socket, so I'm sure there's a manufacturer out there that built one that's better than this one, that's a little bit deeper and doesn't pose the problems that I have with this. But because of those problems, I don't use that when I'm putting this hardware on. I will tell you that a lot of times, usually what I end up doing is I just take my magnet right here, get it socket on, or the nut on just like that, and I'll reach it in, and I'll set a light up in there so I can see what I'm doing, and I can get it onto the stud. So I'm going to show you guys right here. You can get it down there and you can get it started on the stud like so, and just lock it off, and then from there I'll come back with my extension and my wobble and get it tightened down. That was pretty easy to show you because we have good access, but it's the same thing all the way down, and then you just have to be careful not to knock your nut off as you're putting your tooling on to tighten it down. I've seen different tricks, and say something like this where you can use a little bit of this True Glide, which is just like a clear lubricant, kind of like a Silly Glide type stuff, and you can put just a dab of that on the nut, and then that will be just enough to keep your nut in your socket where you can just slide this on. As you can see in this case, I have not put anything on these nuts at all. They're exactly how I removed them. And when I was removing these from the car, I did notice that when I put my tooling on and pulled them off, that they stayed in my socket, which was very nice. And there's really no residue of anything on there, but I can feel that there was something on there, something clear. So the nuts, they feel not sticky, but maybe just a little bit gritty. That is what's enabling us to get those into the socket and stay. So I would presume probably the last guy used something similar to this, where you look at the hardware and it leaves virtually no trace that there's anything there. I've seen, you know, you can use like a little piece of butyl tape. Sometimes you can stick a piece of paper in between the nut and the socket to get it to work. The problem with the butyl tape or the paper is a lot of times you'll leave little pieces of paper down in there, or it leaves some of the butyl tape on your hardware. So I don't like those methods. Fortunately for me, this hardware is good to reinstall. I'm sure if I took some brake clean and wiped them down and cleaned the outside of the body, they would no longer stay in here, which I'm not going to do that to myself. I'm just going to take advantage of what I have here and get them installed. Just using my socket. If I need to jump back to the magnet, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll just work to get all that hardware in, installed, and torqued, and then we'll continue on with the reassembly. Alright, so I already got the hardware in over here on bank 1, so we're just jumping over and doing bank 2. And you can see that I'm getting our wire harnesses for our fuel injectors out of the way. We really need that space for our tooling to get in there, but more importantly, we need to be able to see in there, because we're going to be looking down a runner at an angle at the other runners, so that way we can see what we're doing with our hardware. So the more I can get these out of the way, the better. Kind of get them locked in with the harnesses on the other side over here. We'll grab our nuts and our 8-inch long wobble. We can start here at the front. We can get that a straight shot. It's pretty easy. Now for the rear one, I'm coming in over here, but I actually need to look here via this gap in these runners to see what I'm doing with my hardware. Make sure I'm on the stud and run it down. So you just want to be careful not to drop the hardware. If you drop the hardware, if you're lucky, it's going to fall on the ledge right by the intake port on the head, and you'll be able to see the nut, and you can pop it right out with a magnet. If you're unlucky, it's going to fall down in the valley, and you might be able to fish it out with a magnet, but a lot of times if you can't get it, you have to end up pulling the intake manifold back off just to get that hardware out. You just want to be careful when you're going to put everything in. I would say that I have the benefit of a lot of experience doing this. As you guys can see, I'm moving through this pretty quick. If you're at home doing it yourself for the first time, I would just take your time, because you drop a nut and it's going to end up costing you a lot more time trying to retrieve it than you would have spent by just being a little bit more cautious on the assembly. As you can see, we're halfway done over here on bank 2. That, granted, I have a lot of experience doing this, and it is an early 456, which is the easier manifolds to get on and off, but it's really not too bad. I would say ultimately the key to this is having the wobble extensions. I guess you could try doing this with a universal socket or adapter onto a socket with a regular extension, but I think that would be pretty tough, pretty cumbersome. And I found that these wobble extensions in this particular case have just the right amount of wobble. I really don't need much more than that, so I'm not dealing with the universal joint down at the end of the socket. So if you don't have a set of long wobble extensions, I highly recommend them. If you do enough work and wrenching on your own stuff at home, you're going to love me for getting a set. I use them all the time. They work great in instances just like this. All right, got the last one done. Now I'm going to come back and bring these in hand tight, just like I've done on bank 1. So not really putting much torque to them at all, just snugging them right up to the manifold so they're seated. All right, now we're going to come back and get them torqued. Now that we have the intake manifold reinstalled and torqued, the next step that I like to focus on is getting our fuel rails and injectors reinstalled, and that's really going to allow me to reconnect all the fuel lines so that way I can seal the fuel system back up. Now, before we do the injectors and rails, I will say you need to come back here and plug in your fuel injector wire harnesses, because once your fuel rails and lines are in, you cannot get back here and get them done. I've already got that done, so they're taken care of. Coming over here to our fuel rails and injectors, you can see that I have all the injectors back into the fuel rails, and we're done with the cleaning and flow testing of the injectors. Now I will say that I put each injector back in the exact location it came from, so it's back on the exact cylinder that it was on when it was in the car. Now let's take a second and talk about the results of the injector cleaning and flow test. I will say that if you look right here, this is my before column, or static flow at 650 RPM, 4,500, and 6,000. And really is what I'm looking for is our deviation here. So beforehand it was 12%, meaning that's our deviation's 12% between our lowest flowing injector and highest flowing injector. After our cleaning, it dropped to 3%. At 650, we're at 21%. Our deviation dropped to 10%. I had some issues with this. I'll explain it here in a second, but you can see here at 4,500, we went from 13% to 11%. And then at 6,000, we went from 17% to 18%. So I found it a bit unusual that my deviation increased, even though it was a small amount, 1% at 6,000 RPM. Although I did kind of come across some interesting data when I was doing this. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is when I did the initial flow test, cleaning, and reflowing of the bank 1 injectors, that was a completely separate day from when I did the bank 2 injectors. And I'm not sure if temperature plays a part of that. I would have liked to ran them all in the same day, but timing-wise, it just didn't work out. What I actually found interesting is on the second set of injectors, so bank 2, the ones that I ran those this morning, I actually noticed that this front tube up here actually started to develop a leak. Normally when you run the flow test, these are sealed off on the bottom, they're not draining the fluid out, so you can accumulate and count how much fluid each injector has and compare them across each other. And I noticed that the flow on this injector was incredibly low, and I was like, wow, that's like half of the rest of them. And then I started looking into it and I saw that it was slowly leaking our fluid down. The thing that's interesting about that is depending on the test that you're running the injector on, like if it's at 600 RPM, the test runs a lot longer because it's a slower cycle for the injectors versus the 4,500 and the 6,000 RPM, it really runs the injectors real quick. Is what I'm saying is that test, those higher RPM tests are so quick, there's not enough time for much of that fluid to leak out of the cylinder, so it's easier to get an accurate reading. But at the lower speeds, the fluid sits in there longer and it starts to leak out. But if we know that this one is leaking, it makes me question the rest of them. Are those ones leaking, and we're not able to collect all of the fluid that they're flowing as well. So it kind of makes me questionable on the numbers. I had to kind of disregard the numbers from that front cylinder, move the injector over to one of the other tubes, and then rerun it to be sure that I actually capture what it got. But my whole point of running these injectors during the timing belt services is just to ensure that they're good. I usually do see a small cleanup of the injectors where the deviation gets a lot tighter, the numbers get closer to what they flow. They usually pick up a little bit in flow after you clean them, so there is a tangible difference that you see on those, and it will ultimately help keep the car run a little bit smoother, really help with fuel trims and just longevity. But also the main point is I can get a visual on my flow pattern, I can get a visual on the flow rate. We have tangible recorded data on how well they flow, that we know the injectors are good. Not ideal, because I need to now look into my cleaning machine and see why we're leaking down on that front tube. But nonetheless, they're taken care of, they're cleaned, all the injectors look good. So now they're ready to go back into the car. Alright guys, we were making great progress on the reassembly of this 456, but unfortunately we've come to a stopping point. There's really not a lot more I can do at this point. We have the engine assembled, as I just mentioned, as far as I can go. I finished up the fuel rails, they're in, all my fuel lines are connected. You do need to pay attention back here because they want to overlap, make sure they're not hitting. Make sure we have adequate clearance here of the fuel rails on the side. Got our additional wire harness on. Air boots, all the wiring connected, our throttle cables on, everything's taken care of there. And also took care of all the small crankcase vent lines, or the fuel charcoal vent lines right here, and vacuum hoses. And again, these bolt onto the plenum. They're attached to a nipple underneath the throttle bodies. So all of that's taken care of. What we would need to get this car running would have the air boxes in, our radiator in, oil cooler in, put fluids in it, and we'd be ready to go. Unfortunately, as you can see, still have no radiator. When I did the initial inspection on this car, we noted that the radiator was leaking. It's actually something the client had picked up on too, and one of the reasons why it came here. After looking at the radiator, I saw that it was leaking out of some braze joints, so I thought it was going to be a pretty simple repair. Pop the radiator out, send it to the radiator shop, have them braze it back up. We'd have the radiator back in no time. And I did that before we even started the timing belt service. Unfortunately, as it turns out, the radiator needed a full rebuild. It needed a whole new core. They had to order the core in, and then there's just the turnaround time. So long story short, the radiator is taking much longer than I anticipated. And unfortunately, I don't have it back yet, and it might be, I can't remember what they told me, it might be a week or 2 more weeks to have that radiator back, which really, really sucks, because if I had the radiator back, we'd be able to finish the service up, get the car running, and really complete the job, get all of our final checks done, work to get the car back to the client. But not only do we not have the radiator, the oil cooler is bolted to the radiator, and the oil cooler is out of the car as well. So you can see here I have that. So even with the oil cooler out of the car, there's just no hope to even get the car running. Not that I would really want the car running without a radiator in it anyways. That's why I'm leaving all the air boxes off, because the air boxes sit right up here, and then there's these fiberglass ducts that sit on the side that really channel air up into the air boxes, and having those out makes it a lot easier to get the radiator in and out. Rather than put them in now, there's honestly just no point. We just need to wait till the radiator's back. We'll get it reinstalled back into the car, finish our assembly, then we can move through with our final checks. So the way things are looking, there's a strong chance that I might actually have to pause on this 456, get it off the lift, bring another car in here and service that while I'm waiting on the radiator. Not really sure what scheduling is going to look like in between the two cars and when we're going to finish this 456 up. Now I do have a few small things that I can do to this car while we're waiting on the radiator to get back. One of them is the airbag control unit. Now during our pre-service inspection, we had noted that we had an airbag light on. I had no communication with the control unit. I diagnosed it and deemed it to be a failed control unit. Well, I sent that out for repair, and I got that back, and they said that they were able to fix it, so I'm kind of eager to get that reinstalled and hooked up and get our SD1 on the car to confirm, like, did we actually get that repaired or not. I also need to adjust the right-hand window, so I think that one's going to be a pretty minor adjustment. I just need to stop the window from overextending it in the top of its travel, because it overextends and then pushes out. So if I can just limit its upward travel when the door shuts and the window goes to press into the window seal, I think we can fix that problem pretty quick and easy. And I think the other thing I need to take care of is fuel filters. That's part of the timing belt service, but nothing really exciting. So I'm going to get those fuel filters installed. I will take the old ones out. I'll cut them open. I do so because I want to check the condition of the paper element in the filter. I want to be sure that it's not full of any black sludge or rubber, because there's a lot of rubber in these 456 fuel tanks that hold the fuel pump into its housing, and that rubber deteriorates and it starts to clog your fuel filters, and it could potentially get into your injectors. So since we're just replacing the filters as part of the service, I always just make a habit of cutting them open to get a visual inspection on the paper, because if we're having that rubber deteriorate in the fuel tank, it's going to show up in the filter. So here's how it's looking. I'm going to finish those smaller tasks up tomorrow. As for you guys, I'll see you back here once we have that radiator back in hand.